Hey everyone, welcome to Pit Stops at Podium, the Rev Partners podcast, where we talk to execs who have competed and won, taking their companies from high growth to high scale. My name is Brandon Tolson. I am the co-founder and CEO of Rev Partners, and I'm delighted to have with me today Aaron Hurst for this edition of Pit Stops to Podium. Welcome, Aaron.
Thanks, Brendan.
Well, Aaron, I guess we got to know each other, man, it's a long time now, when I was at QA Symphony working with Dave Kyle. That's probably 5 or 7 years ago, right?
Yeah, probably about 5, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Well, and Aaron, just so to introduce you to the community, you have a really unique role at a really amazing community called Endeavor. So I'd love for you to share with the audience who Endeavor is, what you're doing, and what your role is within the organization.
Yeah, happy to do it. So I am the founding managing director of Endeavor Atlanta. We are one of 40 Endeavor affiliate offices around the world, and Endeavor is a really unique global organization that selects and supports high growth entrepreneurs in underserved geographies, and then provides them with the services they need to scale their business no matter where they're located. And then our long-term mission, we're actually set up as a nonprofit, is to dramatically increase the ability for a founder in an underserved geography to create a high growth, highly scalable, highly valuable venture, creating jobs, creating wealth, and hopefully creating what we'll talk about later, this idea of a multiplier effect that places like Silicon Valley have now become famous for, where you see generations upon generations of innovative companies and entrepreneurs creating and scaling companies.
Yeah, I love it. And I've been fortunate to see some of the work you've done firsthand and some of the entrepreneurs that are part of the ecosystem. I think, in fact, we've had a few guests on this podcast that are part of Endeavor. I think about Robin with RoadSync. We've talked about Dave, my former boss at QA Symphony. And I think Rob Foreman, too, may be involved from SalesLoft. So You're doing great work and you have great people around you. Aaron, before we get into the big idea, we do have a tradition here at Pit Stops at Podium, and that's to get to know our guests outside of work. So what are 3 fun facts our audience should know about you?
Yeah, I'll start with my favorite, which always is a fun one at a cocktail party. My wife's name is Erin as well, spelled differently. It's E-R-I-N. So she has the traditional female Irish name, and I have the, I guess, Old Testament male spelling. But when people, we meet them for the first time or we introduce each other, I always like to say, yes, we're homonyms, and it's like an intelligence test for people. So either they don't understand what that means and they walk away, or they do and they have a good laugh. So that I'd start there.
How do you know who to respond to the question in light of the names?
How do I know who to respond to?
The person.
Good question. So it's funny. I think within our family, you get good at picking up tones and like who they're talking to. So if they need me, it's like more of a yelling, kind of grunting tone, like they need dad, or they say dad or mom too. They don't usually say Aaron. And I think amongst our family, we also can kind of pick up on tones. And thankfully for individual cell phones, individual emails, we don't have a home. I don't know who has a home phone anymore. My parents probably do. Maybe your parents do as well. But thankfully, we live in an individualized world, so it doesn't become that big of a problem.
Well, that's definitely a unique fun fact. What else you got?
Yeah. So one other one I think for the nature of your podcast, I've paid my way through college twice. So I went to Georgia Tech undergrad, paid my way out of state through college, waiting tables, co-oping at a software company called Manhattan Associates. And then I decided to do it all over again and went to grad school for my MBA at UNC. So not only paid my way through college twice, I dumped a lot of money into the Atlantic Coast Conference. So yeah.
Well, that says a lot. So that's really cool. What's your third?
Third, I guess in the spirit of sharing what I like to do. So I have 3 amazing kids. They're 12, almost 10, and 6 years old. So I love spending time with them. They play different sports and have different activities. I love golf, so I'm maybe not so secretly anymore, trying to get at least one of my kids to enjoy golf as much as I do. So that's my secret mission with sports and my kids.
How's that going so far?
It's a work in progress, Brendan. We actually joined my board chairman, David Cummings, as an investor and co-founder of something called In-Town Golf Club. Yeah. So we were lucky enough to recently join, and it's simulated golf. So my son loves video games, my oldest son, of course, so he plays Fortnite or whatever. And so this is like the perfect entry to golf, is to go play simulated golf, for an hour versus a 5-hour round, in 95-degree heat in the summer.
That's a great spot. It's a great strategy for for your ultimate goal.
I don't know if it is, or it's work in progress. Hopefully it will work.
That's great. Well, Aaron, as always, it's fun to hear a little bit about our guests outside of just the work context. So thank you for sharing. Let's transition to the big idea. We kind of teased it out with what you do today from an Endeavor perspective, but I think this is a really powerful topic, especially for the entrepreneurs in our audience. And it's really around, why and our entrepreneurial community is important. And what we always like to do is kind of park on three key areas. But before we get into why it's so important, let's dive into that why. Let's get in the context in light of what you've done, what you'd share with this audience.
Yeah. So the idea of entrepreneurial communities, or what we call communities at Endeavor, aren't new. I think people often call them ecosystems. They take different forms. Sometimes it's a program that you join. Sometimes it's an accelerator where you're maybe giving up equity in your company to be a part of a community. So there's lots of sort of shapes and forms for what they might look like, in your industry or for your type of company or in your geography. But to kind of jump into the why is it important? These communities are really how you tend to see thriving entrepreneurial hubs form. And sometimes traditionally those hubs are physical, meaning they're in certain geographies, like we talked about a minute ago with Silicon Valley, but you've seen that happen in other places, mainly along the coast in the US, but in other places like Tel Aviv and Israel or London or other parts of Europe and Asia. But yeah, the idea of community of having a place, and it could be a digital place too, where you can meet like-minded founders or entrepreneurs, you can get the resources you need, whether it's capital, it's mentors or advisors, it's talent, or maybe it's even early customers. It's such an important thing. And then if you think about how these entrepreneurs and then these communities, spawn more companies and inspire others and kind of pay forward. And I know we'll talk about it later. It's such an important concept for how economies grow, right? So if one founder sort of scales, has success, doesn't mentor anybody, doesn't invest any capital, I'll take kind of the extreme, opposite end of what we're looking for, isn't a part of a community. Think of all the lost opportunities for their knowledge, for their inspiration of their story, for, if they didn't give any equity to anybody, that's obviously a personal decision. There's the wealth, kind of generation piece of it. And just their expertise, right? It's all kind of gone and locked up, and it doesn't go to the next generation. So I think there's a kind of an important societal component to entrepreneurial communities as well.
Yeah, I think you probably hear more than I do, but there is a loneliness factor of being an entrepreneur and like isolation. And regardless of how big the company is, at that level, it's not always easy to share within your four walls. And so having that outside trusted advisors who are cohorts in terms of their responsibilities can, I'm sure, add immense value in a lot of different areas.
Yeah, for sure. And so, yeah, at a founder or entrepreneur level, right, there's, I think, three main things that these communities really are, add a lot of value for, or why they're really important. One is speed, right? So it doesn't matter if you're creating a local restaurant. We just talked about our local restaurant, The Grove, here in Decatur, or a, highly scalable venture-backed software company. You're fighting against time all the time, right? And so being a part of a community or a network, whatever word you want to use, or an ecosystem, or if it ends up being an accelerator, whatever, those networks should be geared, if you're in the right ones, to help you, speed up your ability to learn, your ability to find the right connections, right? Whether it's for capital or for advisors or for new talent or maybe new customers or new markets. So I think speed is a big reason why, finding your entrepreneur community, the right one for you and your company, is important. The second one is it's important to have some mechanism to pull yourself out of the day-to-day of your business as an entrepreneur. We see it all the time. I'm sure in the companies you work with, especially the earlier stage ones, you probably see it all the time. I think what you guys do at Rev Partners is helping companies get out of the weeds from a revenue operations perspective, which is awesome. But these communities can help you do that, right? They can get you 10, 20, 30,000 feet up and go, well, okay, wait a minute. If I, hired these other two people instead of just trying to do it all myself, I could really focus more on the next 12 to 18 months of my company versus like just surviving the next 2 to 3 days. Right. I think a good community will do that for entrepreneurs. And then the third, I think you mentioned a minute ago, is stress management. So, it is being a founder is the loneliest thing I think in the world. I like to say it's one of the most courageous things a human can do, right, is to start a company from zero. So having a community of other people who are going through the exact same journey is super important, because there's few people, if any, that you can talk to. You can't always talk to your investors. You can't always talk to your spouse or significant other or your family. You can't necessarily talk to your co-founders, right? So if you have a community of others that you can connect with and even just share war stories is hugely important.
Yeah, it's pretty compelling, and it resonates with me for sure. Well, and I'm curious too, Aaron, just in terms of, with what's happened in the world with COVID and people being remote. You mentioned kind of physical and digital. I'd just be curious to see your take on, has it emphasized how important this is as a result of what's been going on? I'd love to hear your observations of community in the context of COVID and some of the observations you've seen over the last few years.
Yeah, it's a really interesting time for sure to think about community, especially for entrepreneurship. Yeah, I think both are important. I think COVID certainly has shined a light on, humans' ability to kind of push through a time where we can't be together in person, which is, amazing, in itself, obviously fueled by technology. So if we didn't have Zoom and other, and internet technologies to make that happen, it would have been a pretty dark time for the last couple of years, even though it obviously has been dark on its own. It's been interesting as we got, towards the last 6 to 12 months of the 2-year COVID period, the entrepreneurs we work with have, I would say, unanimously asked for more in person, right? So human connection, there's just something magical about being in a room with people, especially if it's a group of people that you trust and they're a part of a community that you trust and that you value. And it's a group of like-minded, people, or maybe have differing opinions, but, share maybe similar goals and sort of views of the world. You can't get that over a Zoom, right? And so our entrepreneurs now are asking for more in-person events. I don't think I've ever heard, you usually don't hear a busy entrepreneur asking for, hey, Aaron, can I go to more events? We actually have that happening right now, which is pretty, I think that kind of tells you the thing that people have been missing the last few years.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So thanks for sharing. I was just curious to know your observations. So we talked about what the intent of a community is for. We talked about why it's important. So I imagine there are a lot of listeners out here and entrepreneurs that are pretty convicted about that they should do it. So let's talk about how do you figure out which is the right community for you?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the first step is really understanding the kind of business that you are building, right? And what I mean by that is what trajectory, is your business on today, and where do you want to take it into the future? There are lots of different business types. I tend to boil it down to 4 different types of businesses. We actually have a pre-Endeavor program called Scale Up, both in Atlanta and Birmingham, Alabama, where we help the founders. It's a seed to Series A stage sort of program. We help those founders actually figure out what path they're on at a very detailed level, which has been really interesting. So the 4 types are high growth. So think of venture backable businesses. I always remind entrepreneurs that type of company is, very, very rare. It's, I think, less than 2%, right, that actually go on to raise institutional venture capital. So I think, unfortunately, we live in a time where it's sexy to be venture backed. Maybe it's always been sexy, but I don't think we've ever had a sexier time to, right, to announce your Series A or your seed round or your D round. But most businesses aren't that type of business. So I kind of caveat high growth is, maybe we should have put that at the bottom, because that's the least, that's the least common business. The next one I'll say is a bootstrapped growth business. So these are companies that, given the market that they're in, or the product that they're building, or the service they offer, they don't necessarily have to go out and raise capital, but they can continue to grow really nicely. there may be an opportunity in the future where they can bring in a growth equity or private equity type of investor to help them scale even further. You often see companies that end up doing roll-up strategies later on, kind of fitting in that bucket. So not quite venture, high growth, hyperscale, whatever word you want to use, but still growing quickly and but can maybe call their shots, if you will, because the market, dictates that. The third kind of company is, I call them quick exits. So maybe a very competitive market. Maybe your company's a little bit late to that market, or there's others that have kind of scaled very quickly, or your niche, it got really small quickly given other entrants into the market. So it's something you kind of have to think about doing something with quickly over the next few years. And then the fourth, maybe I should have started here. Most common business type is a self-sustained business, right? This could be anything from kind of the local restaurant or boutique retail store to an e-commerce business that makes certain products for a very specific audience. You kind of think small TAM, but can be profitable, may not have the greatest margins, but could be an amazing business, right? Right. So I think the first step is figuring out what kind of business are you building, what kind of business do you want to build? And then that really should dictate the type of community that you should join. So if you're building a self-sustaining business, you shouldn't apply to Techstars, right? Right. If you are building a Techstars kind of high growth venture business, then sure, that's a fantastic opportunity, or YC or whatever other accelerator you wanted to pursue. I'd also add there's lots of industry vertical specific programs and communities that people can join. And then there's ones that are, they're more horizontal across entrepreneurs. So organizations like EO, which Atlanta has a very active, thriving chapter. I think the quality can vary depending on geography, but EO is a great organization globally that entrepreneurs can get involved with. And you could be a high growth business, but you might also be a nice self-sustaining business, right? And you still could commiserate and be in community with entrepreneurs across different types of companies.
Yeah, I like that. I think what it does is it gives people permission. And I think what you were describing earlier is the perception is that this is exclusive for that VC-backed hypergrowth or high growth, however you want to categorize it. But the reality is that there are communities for all different types of companies. And this community concept should be for everyone, because the need, as you described earlier, is for all these different types of categories. And so understanding who you are and accepting that and not being, I think it's an important part, and then ultimately creating that community around you to have like-minded individuals in a similar type of industry or category or segment.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, there's nothing worse than, like I mentioned a minute ago, than seeing entrepreneurs that are spending tons of time applying to venture type accelerators, or thinking that they're on maybe a high growth venture path and they're really not, right? Like that's kind of the worst outcome, where you're asking for resources and being in community with folks that your business just isn't the right fit for. And maybe if you're lucky enough to get capital, you now have investors that aren't necessarily aligned with the path that your business might be on. So
it reminds me of, we had a previous guest, Charlie Paparelli, also in the Atlanta area, kind of angel investor, and he talked about, every services company wants to be a software company. Every software company wants to have a services company, and it's just like, stay in your lane. And it kind of reminds me of that, of like, accept who you are and be okay with it, and really own it and start to pursue it. So I think that's a really good reminder. So we talked a little bit about why it's important. We talked about, if you're an entrepreneur or founder, how do you find the right community for you? But let's talk about, the impact, meaning we talked a little about giving it forward and multiplier effect, but let's flesh it out a little bit further as to what can happen when you pursue these communities.
Yeah. And given that Endeavor focuses on high growth, venture backable types of companies, I'll use that lens, but I think that can apply to, the other kind of four or the other three types of businesses that we just talked about. So focusing more on high growth businesses and communities for high growth businesses, I think most people don't realize, unless they're involved in, high growth technology businesses or in venture, that Silicon Valley, the San Francisco Silicon Valley area, was really just a rural, tiny farm town as late as the early 1960s, right? And all it took was a couple of really ambitious early silicon chip entrepreneurs, founders, to really kind of push the limits on what they thought they could do, scale their business. And then the most important part, instead of disappearing once they had success with companies like Fairchild Semiconductor, they paid it forward. So you had the founders of Kleiner Perkins kind of spawn off of that early, silicon chip company days. You had Intel get founded by those, some of those founders. You had the first check written to Steve Jobs and Wozniak at Apple was from folks that were at Intel, right? I can't remember the gentleman's name. So it didn't take a lot. It was literally just a couple of, companies that scaled, went big, and then plugged back their time, their money, their knowledge, their credibility back into that one ecosystem. And then you compound that over 60 years. And now you have this, area that's population wise is, I think, smaller than Metro Atlanta, but has created, some of the most innovation, most technology here, most of the technology the world uses today and the internet, et cetera, it comes from one little tiny spot in Northern California. It's kind of crazy to think about. So I think if you kind of zoom out on that concept, right, it doesn't take many big successes where you have this paying it forward happening to really transform an economy. And that's what Endeavor tries to do, right? And it's in each geography's own unique way. So we're not taking, everything has to be like Silicon Valley kind of lens to places like Atlanta or Argentina or Spain or South Africa. Like each culture and each ecosystem is different. But this idea of obviously thinking big, getting the right support and community behind you to make that happen, and the resources you need to scale, but then paying it forward, that anybody can do that. It just takes time and kind of concentrated focus.
Yeah, I like giving that lens of the Silicon Valley, what it was, 67 or 50, 60 years ago to what it is now. And since we're both in Atlanta and you're focusing on Endeavor Atlanta, I think it'd be really cool to kind of get that practical. You mentioned every geo is a little bit different in terms of how it can manifest itself. But I think there's a fun Atlanta story that would be good for our audience to hear.
Yeah. So at Endeavor, we call this the multiplier effect. This idea that, a few individuals or a few companies that are run obviously by a few individuals or by people can have just an outsized impact on an ecosystem. And Atlanta's had some great entrepreneurs, but one that comes to mind, and, selfishly, he's my board chairman at Endeavor Atlanta, but he has demonstrated this for our ecosystem. That's David Cummings. So, David has founded multiple companies. Pardot was kind of his first big one that he scaled, not to a huge size of employees or even revenue, but, had a very successful, outcome financially. And instead of kind of disappearing or, keeping his money and not doing anything with it back in the ecosystem, he bought, the old Atlanta Business Chronicle building, which is now the Atlanta Tech Village, to create a home, a physical community for tech startups in Atlanta. Before WeWork existed, before accelerators in Atlanta really existed, right? He invested really early in companies that I'm sure local investors probably looked at and went, there's no way I'll write a check, and now several of those are unicorns like Calendly and SalesLoft, right? He's had other successes with Terminus and Rigor and, countless others. And then he has mentored, probably thousands of entrepreneurs over the last decade, as he, exited Pardot, started the Tech Village, and then, is just constantly in community with entrepreneurs. And that's one person. Obviously, he had an amazing team at Pardot, but one person, in a team that scaled Pardot and then had that success and paid it forward. And, think of all the jobs and all the revenue and the wealth creation that is generated off of just that. And so if Atlanta can do that, 2 or 3 more times even, let alone more than that, think of the impact that that's going to have on our region. And the fun thing to see too, it's this idea of community. Almost when you sign up for a community, you're kind of signing up for paying it forward, right? If you join a church organization or something in your community, or you join the PTA or a board of a nonprofit, like you're paying it forward in some way. Or if you're going to benefit from a community, okay, once I have success, if I have success, I'm going to pay it forward later. Right. And so that's a huge, big, important reason why joining community is important too, because it kind of plugs you into something that you can pay forward later, right? Once you have success.
Yeah, it becomes bigger than yourself. And I think and that's one of the beauties of entrepreneurship and ultimately these communities, is that it not only transforms the individual, but it transforms the community. Not only your micro community, but ultimately a city. We talked about what happened with Silicon Valley, and that ultimately disrupts the world and changes the world. And you're seeing that, as you mentioned, with David Cummings in Atlanta. You see that impact permeate throughout the city, and Atlanta being known for kind of Fortune 500 type companies, established brands of Delta, Coke, Home Depot, et cetera, as now a thriving software technology community. And so it's really just neat to see how these, to your point, the multiplier effect can really shape and change culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And back to your question about, COVID and going digital for a few years, one of the fun positive outcomes of that is our work in the Southeast region. So I have a couple of employees on my team in Birmingham, but now, we have amazing mentors here in Atlanta that are helping a smaller market like Birmingham that's, more nascent, hasn't had as many kind of big wins in the tech community. Our Endeavor entrepreneurs in Atlanta and some of our mentors and board members are mentoring those Birmingham companies, and you're all in the same community. You're in this community of high growth entrepreneurs. So who cares if you're in Atlanta or South Africa or Birmingham, and everybody can hop on a Zoom call. So seeing that kind of barrier break down, I think over the last couple of years has been amazing. And then it's been really fun to see the impact that our kind of later stage entrepreneurs, guys like Dave Kyle, your former boss, CEO of QA Symphony, that they're having now, that they're paying it forward by, mentoring the up and coming entrepreneurs that we're working with.
Yeah, that's great. It's beautiful. Well, Aaron, I really appreciate you coming on board and being on the podcast. I'm convicted, and I'm sure a lot of folks that are listening are as well. So, I know you mentioned the 4 communities. Endeavor is really focused on that kind of scale up or high growth, VC backed. So what will be a practical next step for folks in our audience that kind of fit that category, either in your scale up program or your more established program? What's the next step they can take from an Endeavor perspective, and also as it relates to you?
Yeah. So the beauty of Endeavor is there's not a formal application. So they can just send me an email. It's aaron.hurst@endeavor.org. And, we can grab coffee to talk about their company. For the full Endeavor, network and community that you join for life, we tend to focus on high growth, sort of Series A or right before Series A stage companies, and scale up. Like I said, it's seed to Series A, but scale up does have an application. We're actually closing the Atlanta one this week. So it's probably, unless you're really on it, getting your podcast out, Brendan, they might miss this year's cohort's deadline. And Birmingham just closed at the end of last month, but and we'll be announcing companies that are selected soon. But yeah, feel free to email me or go to our website, and we would love to meet with any entrepreneur.
Well, I think the beautiful thing that you said too is that Endeavor is global, and so from our audience, regardless of where you are, there's like a way in which you can connect and learn more. So don't feel like you're excluded if you're not in Aaron's territory, because there's a lot of great resources out there. But Aaron, thank you so much for sharing a little bit about your story, about the Endeavor story, and the power of community. I really do appreciate you coming on.
Thanks a lot for having me, Brendan.